The autumn sun filtered through the windows of Maple Grove Waffles, casting golden stripes of light across the tiled floor and polished wooden booths. From the outside, the small breakfast shop looked just as it always had, charming, cozy, and bustling with the warmth of maple syrup and morning chatter. But as Michael Thompson stepped through the door wearing a worn hoodie, a faded pair of jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face, he was not stepping in as the founder and owner of the 15-location franchise. Today, he was just another early customer at the place where it all began. The staff had no idea the man scanning the room with quiet eyes was the reason the lights were on. The waffles were sizzling, and the menu above the counter bore the words he had written nearly a decade ago, "Where breakfast feels like home." Michael made his way to a booth in the far corner, where he could see the entire dining room without drawing attention. The location was his original shop, the first Maple Grove Waffles ever opened, and still the busiest by volume. Or at least, it used to be. Recent reports showed a troubling decline in both revenue and customer feedback at this branch. Complaints about slow service, poor attitude, and even rumors of mismanagement had reached corporate, but internal reviews turned up nothing. He had sent quality assurance specialists, posed surprise audits, and even quietly asked upper management for answers, but the data remained inconclusive. Michael had built his company on trust and integrity, and now that same trust was making him uneasy. Something was off, and today he intended to see it with his own eyes. He approached the counter, greeted by a young woman with bright hazel eyes and a well-practiced smile. "Welcome to Maple Grove Waffles. What can I get started for you?" she said, cheerful but slightly robotic. Her name tag read Emma. The smile was familiar. It mirrored the exact tone Michael had envisioned when he created the employee greeting script years ago. "I'll take the golden stack with extra blueberries," he replied in a low, unassuming voice. "And a black coffee." Emma nodded and tapped the order into the screen. "Coming right up. Grab any table you like." Michael paid in cash, avoiding any digital trace, and settled back into his booth, letting the smells of sizzling batter and freshly ground beans envelop him. He watched as Emma returned to the kitchen and began chatting with another employee, tall, dark-haired, and wearing a name tag that read Chris. What Michael hadn't expected was to overhear something that would stop him cold. As Emma leaned closer to Chris, her tone dropped from bubbly to anxious. "I still can't believe what they did to Brian," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder toward the back office. Michael instinctively leaned slightly forward, pretending to check his phone. Chris shook his head, his jaw tight. He did the right thing. Reporting cash theft should have gotten Steve fired, not cost Brian his promotion. Michael's stomach turned. Steve? That would be Steve Reynolds, the store's current manager. Michael had hired him 3 years ago, based on strong recommendations. But something in the way the staff spoke his name told a different story. A knot began to form in Michael's chest as the conversation continued. Emma sighed. He's barely hanging on now. They gave him the worst shifts. No overtime, barely enough hours to cover rent. And all because he spoke up. Chris looked furious. Steve's been skimming from the register for months. 20s, 50s. He does it right in front of the cameras. But nothing happens. I'm starting to think he's got friends higher up. Michael could hardly believe what he was hearing. Theft, retaliation, and silence from corporate oversight. That wasn't just a mismanaged store. That was an infection at the core. He clenched his jaw and stared down at the table, his appetite vanishing. The pain in Chris's voice and the quiet worry in Emma's were unmistakable. They were scared. And worse, they had no faith that anyone would help. A few minutes later, Michael's order arrived, delivered by a young man with hollow cheeks and tired eyes. "Golden stack with extra blueberries?" he asked quietly. "That's me," Michael replied, watching as the server placed the plate down with trembling hands. His name tag read Brian. So this was the employee they had just been talking about. "Enjoy your meal, sir," Brian said, forcing a polite tone. Michael caught his eye. "Thank you, Brian. You doing okay?" he asked, careful to keep his voice kind but curious. Brian froze for a second before managing a faint nod. Just working a double. It's been a long week. Before they could speak further, a voice bellowed from the kitchen. Brian, quit chatting and clean up table 6, and mop the back floor while you're at it. Michael turned to see a heavy-set man with slicked-back hair storming out of the office. Steve, no doubt. His voice was gruff, his attitude pure authority. Brian didn't argue. Right away, he said, turning quickly. As Michael took his first bite of waffles, delicious, despite the bitter atmosphere, he kept his eyes on Brian and his ears open to every detail. It didn't take long to see the pattern. Steve barely lifted a finger, barking orders and criticizing every move Brian made. Emma and Chris worked hard, but their smiles faded every time Steve walked by. And then, when a group of corporate-looking guests walked in, Michael noticed a dramatic shift. Steve suddenly became polite, professional, full of charm, personally greeting the suits, offering free samples, and cracking jokes like the perfect manager. One of the men clapped him on the shoulder like an old buddy. Michael recognized him. Richard Grant, the regional director. In that moment, the puzzle began to fit. Richard, too, was part of the problem. If he was protecting Steve, it explained why reports were ignored and why Brian was suffering for doing the right thing. Michael finished his coffee in silence. The store, the people, the values, this was his legacy. He had built Maple Grove Waffles from scratch, putting everything he had into making it a place where employees felt respected, where customers felt welcome. But now it was being twisted by men who saw it as just another opportunity to take advantage. He had tried fixing it the official way. It hadn't worked. Now he would have to go deeper. He glanced one last time at Brian, who was silently sweeping the floor, shoulders sagging, eyes distant. Then Michael rose, left a generous tip with Brian's name written on the receipt, and walked out the door, his mind set on what had to come next. Tomorrow, the owner would vanish. In his place, a new employee named Matt Taylor would walk in through that same door, ready to change everything from the inside. 2. Michael returned to his car and sat in silence for several minutes, staring out the windshield at the shop he once considered the crown jewel of his growing brand. The waffles had tasted the same, golden, fluffy, rich, with warmth, but everything else had felt different, wrong. The atmosphere inside had been tense, a quiet strain undercutting every interaction. What he'd heard from Emma and Chris confirmed his worst fears. His store wasn't just underperforming, it was unraveling from the inside. And now, seeing Brian up close, clearly running on empty, trembling as he worked, made it impossible for Michael to ignore the human cost. The young man looked like someone who had once believed in something, only to have it broken and replaced by exhaustion. Michael couldn't shake the image of Brian's eyes, hollow, flickering with the last of a flame that had once burned bright. Something had to be done. Back at his temporary apartment across town, Michael opened his personal laptop and pulled up Brian's employee file using his executive access. Just 2 years ago, Brian Jennings had been a model staff member. His evaluations were glowing, punctual, respectful, consistently exceeding performance targets. He had been promoted to shift lead 6 months after joining and was on track for an assistant manager position by the end of the year. But then, abruptly, the records shifted. Notes began appearing. Struggles with authority, inconsistent attitude, needs closer supervision. His hours were slashed, and within 3 months he was stripped of his leadership role. No formal write-ups, no HR investigation, just a downward spiral. Michael leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. This wasn't the trajectory of someone who had failed. This was what retaliation looked like, written in sanitized HR language. The next day, Michael returned to the shop in disguise, hoping to observe more without drawing attention. It was mid-morning, between the breakfast and lunch rush, and the energy inside was oddly subdued. Brian was working the floor again, this time alone, delivering plates and clearing tables. Steve Reynolds, the store manager, was perched behind the counter with a phone in one hand and a smug grin on his face. He made no effort to help, instead barking occasional orders across the dining room like a drill sergeant inspecting soldiers. "Brian, those syrup dispensers aren't going to refill themselves," he snapped. "And don't forget the front windows. Filthy again." Michael watched closely. Brian didn't react. No protest, no comment, not even eye contact. He just nodded and moved silently to the next task, his face a mask of quiet submission. That kind of obedience, Michael realized, didn't come from respect. It came from fear. What disturbed Michael more than Steve's open abuse was the complete absence of oversight. No one stopped him. No one even looked surprised. Staff avoided eye contact with Steve, walking on eggshells, as though they were all just one mistake away from being the next Brian. This wasn't just poor management, it was a culture of intimidation, a culture that didn't happen overnight. Michael knew from experience that when fear becomes normal, it's because those in charge have either condoned it or turned a blind eye. The only person who seemed to operate with genuine care was Emma. Michael saw her slip Brian a bottle of water during a short lull, whispering something that brought the faintest flicker of relief to his expression. But even Emma looked over her shoulder while doing it, as if kindness was something that could get her punished too. Later that afternoon, another piece of the puzzle walked through the front door in the form of Richard Grant, regional director for the entire district. Michael recognized him instantly. Richard had been one of the earliest hires in Maple Grove's expansion, charismatic, driven, and excellent on paper. Michael had trusted him to oversee multiple stores, including the original location, during rapid growth. But as Richard walked in, wearing a tailored blazer and sunglasses, the dynamic in the room shifted. Steve sprang from his seat like a soldier saluting a general, rushing forward to shake his hand and lead him to the best seat in the house. The two men laughed, whispered, exchanged inside jokes. It was clear they were more than colleagues. They were allies. Michael's heart sank as he watched Steve gesture toward Brian while saying something that made Richard laugh. They shared a smirk. That was all it took for Michael to confirm what he already feared. Richard wasn't unaware of Steve's behavior. He was enabling it. The two men disappeared into the back office, and Michael saw Steve glance around before closing the blinds. That single motion felt more incriminating than anything else. Michael could feel the weight of the situation settling on his chest. Brian had tried to do the right thing. He'd seen wrongdoing, reported it, and for that, he'd lost everything. His promotion, his reputation, his energy. And now, the people responsible weren't just safe. They were prospering, laughing, and climbing higher while the honest ones suffered. This wasn't a case of a bad apple. This was a rotting root system infecting everything it touched. If Richard was involved, then corporate investigations would never uncover the truth, because the very people in charge of finding the problem were the ones burying it. Michael knew he couldn't rely on the traditional channels. The only way to fix this was to see it from the ground level, to become one of them, to feel what they felt, to expose it from within. The files, the reports, the gossip, they were just clues. But the truth. The truth lived in those flaws, those conversations, those exhausted eyes like Brian's. And if he wanted to bring that truth to light, he would need to walk straight into the shadows. Tomorrow, Michael wouldn't return as an owner in disguise. He'd return as someone new, someone with no power, no authority, no expectations. Just a name on a schedule, Matt Taylor, part-time hire, food service experience preferred. It was time to meet the monster face to face. And more importantly, it was time to remind him who built the castle he was trying to poison. 3. Michael remained seated in the corner booth of Maple Grove Waffles, his coffee growing cold as he watched the troubling performance unfold around him. Steve Reynolds, the manager entrusted with running the company's flagship location, strutted across the restaurant with forced confidence and inflated charm, especially as Richard Grant continued his casual inspection. To any outsider walking in, it would appear like a well-oiled operation. A manager engaging with a regional director, shaking hands, nodding thoughtfully, even offering up compliments about the fantastic team working under him. But Michael had seen enough. Beneath that polished exterior was something deeply rotten. He watched Steve give Brian a dismissive wave after barking an order, then immediately turn and flash a smile at Richard, guiding him to a VIP table like they were old fraternity brothers catching up. The contrast was staggering. A hard-working young man being run into the ground, while the person doing it received praise, protection, and pastries. As the lunch crowd began to thin, Michael noticed Steve lingering near the register, chatting casually with another employee before suddenly waving them away. Alone now, Steve took over the cash drawer under the pretense of balancing the till. But Michael, trained by years of running his own business, watched his hands with purpose. He wasn't counting. He was skimming. There was a rhythm to the theft. One bill slipped to the side, another quickly pocketed, all done with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 100 times. Steve angled his body slightly away from the camera, not enough to appear suspicious to a casual observer, but just enough to avoid giving a clear view of his hands. And when Richard came back moments later with a coffee in hand, Steve greeted him with a nod, and Michael was certain a knowing glance. That was the moment it all clicked. This wasn't just a rogue manager helping himself. It was a partnership built on deceit. Michael felt a slow-burning fury rise inside him, not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that makes a man stop, breathe, and start planning. This store had once been a symbol of everything he believed in: honesty, community, and the idea that people mattered as much as profit. But now, it had been twisted into a tool for personal gain by men who saw opportunity in other people's silence. The betrayal wasn't just in the theft. It was in the humiliation of good employees like Brian, who had once hoped for a future here. Michael watched as Brian quietly restocked napkins and condiments without being asked, visibly drained, yet still doing his job without complaint. A manager should have praised that kind of dedication, not punished it. And yet, there was Steve, throwing another grin toward Richard, cracking jokes about how hard it is to find good help these days. Michael could hardly believe his ears. He left the restaurant that afternoon in a state of quiet resolve, his mind racing with questions, but his purpose clearer than ever. What good was being the owner if he couldn't protect his people from this? What point was there in building a company with values if those values were optional once you reached a certain pay grade? Michael had spent years cultivating Maple Grove Waffles, not just as a business, but as a community, one where young people could get their first job, where customers could feel a sense of warmth, and where integrity mattered more than cutting corners. Now, he realized, the systems he had trusted were not enough. HR had failed. Oversight had failed. And worst of all, the people he had put in power had betrayed that trust. The only way to get the truth, the real truth, was to live it. Not from an office, not through a report, but from inside the walls of the store itself. That night, he sat at his desk and began rewriting his resume, not as Michael Thompson, CEO of Maple Grove Waffles, but as Matt Taylor, an out-of-work food service worker looking for something stable. He crafted a believable backstory, listing 2 smaller cafes he had supposedly worked at, careful to include experiences that would justify knowing how to use the register and kitchen equipment, but not so polished as to raise questions. He listed a prepaid phone number, created a separate email address, and even printed a physical copy of his resume, something few people did anymore, but that added just the right touch of sincerity. He chose a different part of town to put down as his residence. Everything about Matt Taylor had to feel real, someone desperate, reliable, and grateful to be given a chance. Someone Steve wouldn't see as a threat. The next morning, Michael walked into the shop just as the now hiring sign was being taped back to the window. He wore a thrift store polo shirt, worn jeans, and carried a modest folder with his resume tucked inside. Emma was working the front that morning and greeted him with a smile that faded slightly as she looked at the sign. "We're pretty short-staffed," she said, before he could speak. "Manager's in the back. He's doing interviews on the spot today." "Perfect." Michael nodded politely and walked to the counter where Steve stood, reviewing the day's schedule with a pen in hand. "You looking for work?" Steve asked, barely glancing up. "Yes, sir." Michael replied, handing over the resume. Steve skimmed it for all of 5 seconds before shrugging. "Can you start tomorrow?" "Absolutely," Michael answered, hiding the satisfaction that pulsed behind his eyes. The trap was being set. 4. The morning air was crisp as Michael stepped out of his car, now fully embodying his new identity, Matt Taylor. Gone were the tailored suits, the expensive timepiece, and the air of authority that came with being the founder of Maple Grove Waffles. In their place was a second-hand polo shirt, an off-brand digital watch, and a humble resume tucked into a backpack. His hair was mussed just enough to suggest a rushed morning, and his shoulders slouched slightly to reflect someone used to being overlooked. As he approached the entrance to the flagship location, a part of him hesitated. It had been years since he had worked an opening shift, clocked in as an hourly worker, or taken orders from someone who didn't know who he really was. But that hesitation dissolved the moment he walked through the door. If his business had truly become a breeding ground for toxicity and theft, then he owed it to everyone who still believed in what Maple Grove was supposed to be to see it from the inside. Inside the store, things were already moving. The scent of hot batter and syrup filled the space as the griddle sizzled behind the counter. Emma, already in her apron, looked up and offered a surprised smile. "You're early," she said, handing him a fresh uniform shirt. "Let's get you started." Michael, now Matt, nodded. "I like being early," he replied, slipping into the back to change. Training was fast. Too fast. Emma rushed through the register procedures in between taking orders, explaining things on the fly with an apologetic tone. "Steve doesn't like us spending too much time on training," she muttered. "Says it wastes labor hours, so just follow my lead for today." Michael nodded and kept his eyes and ears open. Within an hour, he had already started to see what Emma meant. Steve rarely left his office, except to make an appearance when something went wrong or when someone from corporate was scheduled to visit. When he did emerge, it was usually to criticize: napkins not stocked, counters not wiped, orders taking too long. He offered no help, only complaints, and always found a way to single out Brian. Despite Steve's hovering presence, Michael could see the store ran because of people like Emma and Brian. Emma moved between the register and tables with practiced efficiency, while Brian restocked supplies, cleaned up, and even helped other employees with difficult customers, always calm, always quiet. When Steve wasn't yelling, he was showing a completely different side of himself to certain patrons, mostly well-dressed men in suits who greeted him like an old friend. "Morning, gentlemen," he would beam. "Can I get you the usual? On the house, of course." Michael watched carefully. The contrast was jarring. Steve played 2 different roles: the tyrant to his staff and the charming host to his corporate allies. That duality wasn't just a personality flaw, it was a strategy. And it worked, because no one from corporate ever seemed to stay long enough to see what happened after the charm faded. Emma later whispered to Michael that one of the regulars was Richard Grant's cousin. "That's how Steve gets away with everything," she said. "Everyone up top thinks he's golden." By the end of his second shift, Michael had managed to build a quiet camaraderie with Brian. It started with casual conversation, shared jokes about bad customers, comments about the music playing over the speakers, little observations that made Brian crack the occasional smile, but it was during their time stocking the walk-in cooler that the trust began to form. "You seem to pick things up fast," Brian noted as they sorted out boxes of waffle mix. "Worked in food service before," Michael answered simply. "Place like this feels familiar." Brian didn't say much after that, but Michael noticed the walls around him begin to loosen. There was something about the way Brian carried himself, methodical, cautious, always watching. It wasn't paranoia, it was self-preservation, and Michael understood that better than anyone. Trust, in a place like this, wasn't given. It was earned, and always at a cost. One afternoon, Michael volunteered to help Steve count the register. It was an opportunity too good to pass up. As Steve rifled through the drawer, Michael stood nearby, pretending to wipe the counters but watching closely. The way Steve moved his hands, the way he leaned slightly to obscure the camera's view, the way certain large bills disappeared into his coat pocket. It was clear this wasn't his first time. "You'll get used to the rhythm here," Steve said without looking up. "Fast-paced. Gotta stay sharp." Michael smiled tightly. "I'm a quick learner." He stored every detail in his mind, every shift in tone, every trick, every sleight of hand. But he knew observation wasn't enough. He needed proof. And that meant getting even closer to the rot without alerting the fungus that he was onto it. Over the next several days, Michael, as Matt, integrated himself fully into the team. He opened when asked, stayed late without complaint, and always said yes to the least desirable tasks: garbage, restocking, cleaning the bathroom. His goal was to become invisible in plain sight, the kind of worker who blended in, never made waves, and heard everything. He learned that Emma had once applied for a promotion but was told she wasn't management material. That Chris, the employee who used to buddy up to Steve, now kept his head down and avoided taking sides. And that Brian, though never openly bitter, had begun applying to jobs elsewhere, convinced there was no future for someone like him in a company that rewarded loyalty with punishment. The picture was getting clearer and more painful. Michael had thought this undercover operation might take a few days, maybe a week. But now, he knew, it would take longer, and it would require every ounce of his patience, his training, and his resolve. Because what he was seeing wasn't just mismanagement. It was a betrayal of everything Maple Grove Waffles had been built to represent, and he was the only one who could fix it from the inside. 5. It was nearing closing time on a Thursday evening when Michael found the right moment. The restaurant was quiet for once. The last few customers had left, and the hum of the kitchen had given way to the clink of cutlery being cleaned and surfaces being wiped down. Michael and Brian were in the back, scrubbing the griddle and tidying the prep area. The air was warm, thick with the scent of maple and cleaning spray, but it carried a different kind of weight that night. They worked side by side in near silence, both clearly exhausted from the long shift, until Michael, carefully choosing his tone, broke it. "You know," he said casually, "you're really good at this job. It's obvious you care more than most." Brian didn't look up at first. He scrubbed at a stubborn grease stain like it had insulted him. "Used to think that mattered," he muttered finally. "Turns out, it doesn't." Michael leaned against the counter and wiped his hands on a towel. "What happened?" he asked gently, letting the silence between them settle like dust. For a moment, Brian didn't answer. Then he sighed, set his cleaning rag aside, and turned to face Michael fully. There was no anger in his face, only the kind of quiet defeat that comes from holding a truth too long. "A little over a year ago," Brian began, "I noticed the draw counts weren't lining up at the end of my shifts. At first, I thought it was just mistakes. Bad math, maybe someone forgot to log a comped meal. But it kept happening, always on Steve's days, always when he closed alone." He paused, his eyes drifting toward the office door in the distance. "I started keeping notes. Dates, amounts, even took pictures when I could. Figured if I was wrong, it would all be harmless. If I was right." He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. "I thought the company would want to know." Michael's heart sank as Brian continued, detailing how he'd followed protocol to the letter, submitting a formal report to corporate using the anonymous hotline, just as outlined in the employee handbook. "I thought I was helping," Brian said. "I thought maybe Steve was desperate or struggling, and if someone higher up knew, they'd handle it the right way." But instead of an investigation, Brian was pulled aside by Steve 2 days later and told his hours were being adjusted. Within a week, he'd been removed from the lead schedule, given only closing shifts that stretched into early mornings, and stripped of any responsibilities beyond cleaning and prep. His name vanished from staff group chats, and when Michael asked the obvious question, how Steve found out, it was Brian's next words that twisted the knife. "Chris saw something on my phone," he said quietly. "A photo of Steve taking from the register. I guess he told Steve. Next thing I knew, everything changed." Michael listened, keeping his emotions in check, though his fists clenched behind the counter. This was worse than negligence. It was active retaliation. And it had worked. Brian had been isolated, silenced, and slowly worn down. What shocked Michael most was that Brian hadn't quit. "Why stay?" he asked, genuinely curious. Brian shrugged. "Because rent doesn't care who's right. Because I still thought maybe someone would notice. I just didn't think I'd have to wait this long." That answer hit Michael hard. Here was someone who had placed his trust in a system Michael had built, a system that promised fairness and integrity and had been punished for believing in it. Michael realized this wasn't just about catching a thief anymore. It was about restoring something that had been lost, the basic faith that doing the right thing still mattered. The next day, Michael arrived early and requested to help with inventory, an offer Steve dismissed with a lazy wave of his hand. "Knock yourself out," he muttered. Michael headed to the stockroom and began cross-checking the digital logs with the physical supplies. It didn't take long to spot the problems. Cases of waffle mix marked as delivered were nowhere to be found. High-end ingredients like fresh berries were consistently marked as spoiled, yet still appeared on the menu. And invoices showed inflated quantities that never made it to the shelves. Michael documented everything quietly, snapping pictures with his phone and making notes in a secure app. It was clear. Steve was not only stealing cash, he was manipulating inventory records to hide the profit skim. The system was simple but dangerous. Over-report what was ordered, under-record what was sold, and pocket the difference. Throughout the week, Michael found more signs: register drawers that closed light on heavy sales days, inconsistent tip distributions, and a pattern of stock adjustments that always coincided with Steve's closing shifts. What disturbed him most was how invisible it had all become to the staff. People like Emma and Chris had stopped questioning it. The culture of fear and favoritism had created a blind spot, and Brian had been the only one willing to speak up. Now Michael had both the testimony and the numbers to prove it. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was building a case. He knew from experience that catching a thief wasn't about a single moment of exposure. It was about patterns, proof, and timing. That evening, after another long shift, Michael pulled Brian aside as they clocked out. "I believe you," he said, looking the younger man straight in the eye. "I've seen the same things, and I'm going to do something about it." Brian blinked, startled. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice cautious. Michael paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because the people who do the right thing deserve to know they're not alone. And because I think you deserve a lot more than what this place has given you lately." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. As Brian walked away, something had shifted in his posture. Not a full return to confidence, but a flicker of hope. And for Michael, that was enough to keep going. The next phase had begun. It was time to turn suspicion into certainty and to make sure the people responsible finally answered for what they had done. 6. It was nearing the end of a particularly grueling Friday night shift when the dam finally broke. The kitchen was nearly spotless, the last few trays stacked high, and the smell of burnt oil and waffle batter clung to the air like a second skin. Michael and Brian stood alone in the walk-in cooler, restocking ingredients for the early morning crew. The hum of the cooler muffled their voices from the rest of the store, giving them rare privacy. Michael leaned against a stack of crates, casually wiping sweat from his brow. "You were right," he said in a low voice. The drawer came up light again, and that invoice for berries. Only half the order made it in. Brian didn't react with surprise. Instead, he set down the case he was holding and folded his arms. "It's not just this store," he said evenly. "It's the whole district." Michael's eyebrows lifted slightly, his silence encouraging Brian to go on. "After they demoted me," Brian continued, "I couldn't let it go. I started looking deeper, talking to friends at other locations, checking public inventory logs whenever I could. Same patterns everywhere: register skims, stock marked as spoiled and sold anyway, invoices inflated by vendors that conveniently work with the same managers." His voice was calm, but there was an edge of anger under it, honed by months of being ignored. "They're all doing it. Not every manager, maybe, but enough. And no one's stopping them because Richard Grant is in on it." Michael felt a slow, steady chill move down his spine. "Richard?" he echoed, already suspecting the answer. Brian nodded. "Every time a whistleblower files a report, it disappears. Every time there's a surprise inspection, it ends with pats on the back. Grant covers for them, protects them, takes his cut." The full picture was coming into view now, and it was even uglier than Michael had imagined. The problem wasn't limited to a single location or even a few bad apples. It was a rotted supply chain of corruption, anchored by a regional director who had turned Maple Grove Waffles into a personal ATM. And the worst part? He'd done it quietly, efficiently, and without resistance. It made Michael sick. He had spent years building a company meant to represent community, fairness, and upward mobility. Now, under his nose, it had been twisted into a shadow of that vision. "Do you have proof?" Michael asked quietly. Brian hesitated, then reached into his phone and pulled up an old email draft. "Not everything, but I have some screenshots, patterns, one vendor invoice that showed a double charge, then got wiped from our system 3 days later. I was building a file to send directly to corporate, over Richard's head, but then Chris must have seen what I was doing. That's when everything went south." Michael didn't say it out loud, but in that moment, he silently thanked Brian for holding on, for not deleting the evidence, for trusting that someone would eventually care. He took a deep breath and placed a steady hand on Brian's shoulder. "You did everything right. Now let's finish this together." From that night forward, Michael's mission shifted into high gear. He began spending more time alone in the stockroom, offering to organize inventory while secretly cross-referencing digital counts with physical products. He started using a custom camera button sewn into his apron, capturing photos of altered receipts, marked registers, and suspicious invoices. When Steve would sneak cash from the drawer during peak hours, Michael made mental notes of the bill's serial numbers and where Steve tucked them away. He offered to handle waste logs, where he discovered entire entries forged to show spoilage that hadn't occurred. Each anomaly added another puzzle piece to the bigger scheme, one that now spanned not just locations, but levels of leadership. Richard's role became more apparent each week. His visits, while framed as casual check-ins, were always timed to busy periods, when the store was flooded with cash and distractions were plenty. He'd walk in with a smile, shake hands, make small talk, then vanish into the back office with Steve for 15 or 20 minutes. Every time they emerged, Steve would look visibly relieved. Once, Michael overheard Richard mutter, "Just keep the numbers clean, and we'll be fine." On another occasion, Michael saw Steve slip an envelope into Richard's coat pocket while laughing about a vendor bonus. The way they communicated was coded, but the meaning was crystal clear. Richard wasn't just shielding Steve. He was profiting off the theft and ensuring no trace led back to him. But now, Michael had that trace. Photos, timestamps, transaction records, all slowly piling into a secure folder synced to an encrypted drive he'd built years ago for corporate audits. Except this time, it wasn't about corporate. It was about justice. Despite the weight of what he was uncovering, Michael remained Matt Taylor to the outside world, a quiet, hard-working new hire who always volunteered for the worst tasks and never asked questions. It allowed him to slip under the radar, to see the mechanics of the scam without drawing suspicion. But more than that, it gave him time to connect with others. Emma began opening up about her own suspicions. Chris, once seen as a loyal informant, now avoided Steve entirely, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear. Even the part-time weekend crew had stories, misplaced paychecks, denied vacation requests, and shifts mysteriously changed when someone raised concerns. Michael listened, nodded, and took it all in. The system was broken, yes, but not beyond repair. The staff still cared. They just needed someone to lead by example again, someone to remind them that the values etched on the wall weren't just decoration. They meant something once, and they would again. 7. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of grey sky that matched Michael's mood, heavy, watchful, and tense with something brewing beneath the surface. The store was already bustling when he walked in, slipping back into the rhythm of prep work and polite small talk. But beneath the routine, his thoughts swirled with intensity. He had enough evidence to suggest widespread corruption, but what he needed now was the kind of moment no one could deny. A direct link between Steve and Richard. Something visible. Something undeniable. So when Richard Grant walked into the store around 11:20 a.m., dressed in a crisp charcoal blazer and sunglasses, Michael felt his pulse quicken. Steve greeted him with his usual enthusiasm, escorting him to the back office after a few staged remarks to the team. Michael moved quickly, pretending to restock the condiment bar while syncing his apron camera to his phone, its lens angled just right toward the hallway door. 15 minutes passed, then 20. And then, just as the door opened again, the moment arrived. Through the tiny camera lens, Michael captured it, clear, unambiguous, and damning. As Richard exited the office, Steve handed him a thick white envelope, discreetly palmed between a handshake and a pat on the shoulder. Richard slipped it into the inside pocket of his blazer as casually as if it were a receipt, then smiled as he turned toward the dining area, greeting a few customers with hollow charm. Steve followed behind, the swagger in his step more pronounced than usual. Michael quickly transferred the footage to a secure server and locked his phone, doing his best to appear calm as he continued working the floor. But his mind was reeling. This was it. What he had been waiting for. A direct exchange of what could only be dirty money, more than testimony, more than whispers. He had proof now. And with that proof, the whole web they'd spun was beginning to unravel. Later that evening, after the dinner rush, Steve cornered Michael, still matte in everyone's eyes, by the prep sink. "You're catching on," Steve said, almost approvingly. "Might even move you up to weekend supervisor if you keep at it." Michael smiled tightly. "Just trying to do my part," he replied. Steve clapped him on the shoulder and walked off, never suspecting the new guy already had his crimes backed up on 3 cloud drives. With that encounter fresh in his mind, Michael took the opportunity to double down. He offered to close out the vendor inventory logs for the day and compare delivery manifests with the digital system. While Steve relaxed in the office, Michael uncovered yet another pattern. Steve had been marking premium items as spoiled, removing them from the inventory count, but then still using those same items in menu orders. It was clever. On paper, the waste looked legitimate. In reality, it allowed Steve to skim product and pocket whatever he wanted from the difference in reported versus actual costs. Invoices from supplier companies, especially one called Golden Prairie Produce, showed inflated prices and quantities that never arrived. Some products appeared twice in the system for the same delivery date, suggesting a coordinated manipulation with either the vendor or someone falsifying entries on the back end. And each time Michael dug deeper, the more evident it became that Steve wasn't acting alone. This level of deceit required cooperation, or at the very least, silence. One night, while reviewing waste logs, Emma approached him cautiously. "I shouldn't say anything," she whispered, "but if you're trying to understand how Steve gets away with everything, ask yourself who's always one step ahead of the rumors." She walked away before Michael could ask more, but he didn't have to. He already suspected who she meant. Chris. The realization stung more than he expected. Chris had always seemed like a quiet but well-meaning part of the team, but looking back, there were signs. How he always lingered outside closed-door meetings, how he warned Steve when corporate emails came in, how he avoided eye contact during certain conversations. That night, Michael stayed late under the guise of helping with a deep clean. When the others had left, he found Chris smoking out back near the dumpsters, eyes tired and distant. "Rough week?" Michael asked. Chris shrugged. "They're all rough lately." Michael hesitated, then said gently, "Emma said something about you always knowing things before everyone else." Chris stiffened, his posture guarded. "You spying on me now?" he said, half joking, half defensive. "No," Michael replied, calm. "Just trying to understand how someone like Brian ends up where he is, and why Steve's never been caught." There was a long silence between them before Chris finally spoke, his voice low. My mom's sick, he said. Lupus. Meds cost more than I make in 2 weeks. Steve found out and said he'd guarantee me full hours, no night shifts, no cuts, if I kept him in the loop. So I did. I kept my head down, passed along anything that sounded like trouble. I didn't know it'd lead to Brian getting destroyed. He looked away, shame creeping into his features. Michael felt a complex wave of emotion, sympathy, frustration, and understanding. The system hadn't just corrupted people, it had exploited their desperation. You still have a choice, Michael said, to stop being part of it. Chris didn't respond, but for the first time, he didn't walk away either. Michael knew the tide was turning. He had the footage. He had the paper trail. Now he had the human cost, the lies, the pressures, the quiet deals made under duress. The system was starting to crack, and Michael was ready to bring it down, brick by brick. Oh, wait. By the start of the next week, Michael knew he was running out of time. The evidence was mounting, but so was the damage. Brian was wearing thinner by the day, dark circles deepening under his eyes, his frame shrinking beneath the weight of back-to-back double shifts and relentless pressure. And yet, somehow, the young man kept showing up, kept sweeping, kept restocking, as if refusing to give the system the satisfaction of breaking him. Michael could see the toll it was taking and knew that if something didn't change soon, Brian would walk or collapse. He had to act, not impulsively, but surgically. He needed one shot, one definitive takedown that couldn't be buried by Richard Grant, corporate silence, or any false denials. And that meant setting a trap so tight and irrefutable, not even Steve could slither out of it. The perfect opportunity was coming. Maple Grove's 7th anniversary. The anniversary celebration had been hyped for weeks, with flyers in every store window and promos on the company's social media pages. The flagship location, of course, would be the epicenter of the event. Free samples, discount combo meals, and limited edition waffle flavors were expected to draw in record crowds. Michael knew the implications of that kind of foot traffic: higher sales, more cash transactions, and, in Steve's world, the perfect conditions for skimming. It would be chaos by design, with employees too distracted to notice sleight-of-hand tricks and management too busy with PR optics to question anything out of place. Michael, however, would not be distracted. He would be watching, and this time, he wouldn't be doing it alone. In the quiet hours of Thursday night, long after the store had closed and Steve had disappeared into the night, Michael returned with a duplicate key he'd created weeks earlier, just in case this moment ever came. The modifications were subtle, invisible to the untrained eye. First, he replaced the store's outdated security DVR unit with an identical one, externally at least. Internally, it was fitted with remote syncing and cloud upload capabilities, which would transmit a live feed directly to Michael's encrypted server. He repositioned the hallway camera by a fraction of an inch, giving it a clearer view of the office door and the register's side panel, areas Steve routinely blocked when removing bills. Next came the cash drawer. Michael carefully slipped microscopic amounts of UV-reactive tracking powder onto specific bills, mostly 20s and 50s, marking their corners with a nearly invisible signature that would glow under ultraviolet light. He also folded several high-value bills slightly in one corner, just enough to be identifiable when reviewed in security footage. These bills were mixed into the morning till, prepped, and ready for the weekend. He didn't stop there. He placed small adhesive sensors inside the safe dial and handle, sensitive to pressure and movement, and connected via short-range transmitter to his phone. Every time the safe was accessed, he'd get an alert. He also left a series of inconspicuous QR-coded stickers beneath certain prep surfaces and on the backs of registers. These weren't surveillance tools in themselves, but were calibration markers, used to help match video angles in case footage was questioned. The attention to detail was meticulous, obsessive even. But Michael knew one thing from his years in business. People in power don't fall because of outrage. They fall because of precision. And this plan? It was engineered for collapse. He walked out of the restaurant under cover of darkness, knowing that the next 48 hours would determine the future of everything he'd built. Meanwhile, inside that same store, Brian was unraveling. Despite being promised shorter shifts for the weekend to look fresh for the crowd, Steve had dumped prep and set up responsibilities onto him, claiming that the newer hires weren't experienced enough to handle it. That Friday, Brian came in at 6 a.m. and didn't leave until after 10 p.m., only to be told he was scheduled to open the next day for the anniversary launch. Michael overheard the exchange, Steve's voice dismissive, Brian's face blank. "Just drink some coffee," Steve barked. "We need all hands on deck." Brian nodded quietly, but Michael could see his hand trembling as he wiped down the pastry display case. The exhaustion wasn't just physical anymore. It was spiritual, the kind that crept into the soul and hollowed out a person's belief in fairness, in purpose, in decency. Michael clenched his jaw and silently reaffirmed the mission. The trap wasn't just about catching Steve. It was about freeing Brian. Friday night, Michael stayed late, claiming to help with the final cleaning. Steve left early, as usual, claiming he had to prep marketing materials for the event. Michael knew better. As he walked through the now empty dining room, he paused to look around. The decorations were already half hung. Balloons, streamers, a massive vinyl banner that read, "7 years of waffle wonder." Michael stared at it for a long moment. It was meant to celebrate success, growth, community. But behind the curtain, it would become the day everything changed, the day corruption fell, truth surfaced, and dignity was restored. He turned off the lights one by one, locking up behind him with a quiet sense of finality. Tomorrow, the customers would come for celebration, but Michael would come for justice, and the man who had spent years stealing from his company would finally be caught, not in suspicion, but in action. 9. The morning of Maple Grove. Waffles' 7th anniversary arrived bright and cloudless, with a crisp breeze in the air and a line already forming outside the flagship location by 8 a.m. Balloons bobbed at the entrance, and the smell of sweet batter floated through the open doors. Michael, still playing the role of Matt, stood behind the counter, apron tied tight, watching everything with the calm of a soldier before battle. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with energy. Families ordering combo specials, kids laughing over syrupy bites, and employees darting around the kitchen trying to keep up with the non-stop demand. It was the chaos Steve had counted on. Michael saw him work the room with his usual act, smiling at regulars, greeting guests like a local celebrity. But underneath the polished act, Steve's eyes kept flicking to the registers. He was already calculating how much he'd skim that day, which bills would disappear unnoticed into his coat pocket. Brian arrived just after 9, looking like a ghost of himself. His eyes were bloodshot and his movements slow, robotic. He hadn't had a day off in 2 weeks, and last night's closing shift had left him with barely 4 hours of sleep before Steve scheduled him to open again. Still, he clocked in without complaint and began wiping down the condiment bar, restocking silverware, prepping for wave after wave of customers. But it wasn't long before Steve pounced. Around 10:30 a.m., in the middle of the morning rush, Brian dropped a tray of clean mugs on the way to the dishwasher. None shattered, but the noise drew attention, and Steve, like a predator sensing weakness, saw his moment. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, loud enough for every customer to hear. "You can't even handle a simple tray of cups now? Are you drunk or just incompetent?" The restaurant quieted. Customers looked up from their waffles. Emma froze mid-order. Brian stood motionless, eyes locked on the floor, hands trembling. Michael's heart dropped as he watched the scene unfold. Steve didn't stop there. "Maybe if you weren't so busy feeling sorry for yourself, you'd actually do your damn job," he barked. "People like you are why this place can't run properly." Richard Grant, seated at a table near the back with 2 other well-dressed men, chuckled without looking up, sipping his free espresso. The humiliation cut through Brian like glass. He was exhausted, humiliated, and cornered, but something shifted in his expression. He straightened slowly, not in defiance, but in clarity. Then, in a voice steadier than Michael expected, Brian spoke. "This is—" He stopped, then tried again, louder this time. "This is enough." The entire restaurant seemed to pause. "You scream, you lie, you steal, and we all stay quiet because we're afraid of losing our paychecks. But I'm done." Steve blinked, stunned by the sudden turn. "Excuse me?" he barked. "You want to repeat that?" But Brian didn't falter. "You heard me," he said, placing the tray gently on the prep table. "You've stolen from this company for years. You punish anyone who calls it out, and you think people like Richard here will protect you because they're part of it, but I won't let you humiliate me one more time." The color drained from Steve's face. Richard, now fully alert, shifted in his seat. The kitchen had gone silent. Even the customers had stopped eating, their attention fixed on the confrontation. Then, in one fluid motion, Brian untied his apron, folded it neatly, and set it on the counter. "I quit," he said. "Not because you beat me, but because I won't let you break me." The silence that followed was deafening. Steve stood frozen, unsure whether to lash out or retreat. Emma wiped a tear from her cheek. A few customers started clapping, unsure what else to do. Richard leaned forward as if about to say something, but thought better of it. Brian didn't wait. He walked around the counter, past the front register, and toward the exit with his head held high. For the first time in weeks, Michael saw something in Brian's face that hadn't been there before. Not fatigue, not pain, but peace, dignity, the kind of self-respect that comes when someone finally reclaims their worth. As the door swung shut behind him, the room slowly came back to life. But for those who had witnessed it, nothing would be quite the same again. Michael stood in silence for a moment, watching the reactions. Emma looked shaken, but her eyes were filled with something else: admiration. Chris, who had been clearing plates nearby, stared at the door Brian had just walked through, guilt written all over his face. And Steve. Steve looked like a man who had just realized he'd lost control. His usual arrogance flickered with something less certain, more panicked. And Richard, though still trying to maintain a calm demeanor, checked his watch and avoided eye contact. Michael knew what came next. The trap had been sprung. Now it was only a matter of timing. Brian had taken the first step. Soon, Michael would take the rest. 10. The sky had already turned a deep shade of blue by the time the last customer left the restaurant. Maple Grove Waffles' anniversary celebration had been deemed a success, at least from the outside. The sales numbers had broken single-day records, the limited edition menu had sold out before dinner, and the feedback cards were overflowing with compliments about the staff's energy. But beneath the surface, something very different had been brewing. Michael stood at the back of the dining area, quietly helping Emma wipe down counters, while Steve laughed loudly in his office, no doubt congratulating himself on a job well done. Only Michael knew the truth, that this night, for Steve, would not end in celebration, but in exposure. The trap was set, the stage prepared, and all the cameras were rolling. And so, as Steve waved everyone out of the store with a cocky, "I'll close up tonight," Michael gave a casual nod, removed his apron, and slipped into the parking lot, only to circle around to his car, where his phone had already begun streaming the security feed live. From the screen in his hand, Michael watched the building from the outside as it turned still. The dining lights dimmed. The flicker of movement from the hallway camera showed Steve emerging from his office, keys in hand. At 10:23 p.m., the safe room door opened. The pressure sensor in the handle lit up Michael's phone with a quiet buzz. He adjusted his view and leaned closer. The hidden camera in the ceiling vent captured it all. Steve kneeling at the safe, the door swinging wide, and his hands moving with practiced speed. From the marked drawer, Steve removed bundles of cash, some of them the exact bills Michael had pre-marked with UV powder 2 days earlier. He counted the money quickly, then removed a smaller envelope from the safe's interior and began tucking the cash inside. He sealed it, folded it, and walked to the register. where he retrieved another handful of 20s. All the while, his posture was relaxed, almost bored. It was the posture of a man who'd done this dozens of times and never once been caught. But this time, he was. Every move had been recorded in crisp detail. The safe opening, the marked bills being handled, the envelope being filled, the drawer being manipulated. Michael took screenshots as backup, each one time-stamped and saved automatically to a private server. The money was no longer just missing. It was documented, traceable, and tied to Steve by both fingerprint and footage. When Steve finally turned off the lights and exited through the back door, Michael stayed hidden in his car, watching as the man strolled across the parking lot, duffel bag in hand, and climbed into a luxury SUV, a vehicle no hourly manager could reasonably afford. The taillights disappeared down the street, and Michael remained still for another moment, the glow of the phone screen lighting up his face. It was done. There would be no more doubt, no more secrecy. The moment for confrontation had finally come. That night, Michael barely slept. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by a laptop, 3 external hard drives, a packet of printed documents, and a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Every piece of evidence was reviewed, labeled, and duplicated. The footage was backed up in multiple places, including a hidden drive in his car's glove compartment. He reviewed every invoice discrepancy, every forged inventory report, every still frame of Steve and Richard's under-the-table exchanges. And when everything was in order, he began drafting the agenda for the next morning, an emergency all-staff meeting at 9 a.m. sharp. He sent out the message from his corporate email with a simple subject line: "Owner visit. Mandatory attendance required." Within minutes, notifications began popping up. Mia, Chris, Emma, even the part-timers confirmed. Only Steve hadn't replied. That didn't matter. Michael already had a plan for him. By sunrise, Michael was already suited up. For the first time in weeks, he looked like the man behind the company, the founder, the face, the leader. He walked into the store through the front doors, calm but commanding. The early morning crew barely recognized him at first. The confusion on their faces quickly turned into whispers as he moved past them and into the office. He scanned the space, removed the hidden camera, and packed away the modified DVR. Everything had served its purpose. Outside the office, employees began to gather, unsure of what was happening, but sensing something significant was coming. At 8:50 a.m., Michael stood at the center of the dining room. He looked around at the faces of people who had become more than employees over the past few weeks. These were people he had scrubbed pans beside, shared break-room stories with, and watched endure abuse without ever giving up. Today, they would hear the truth. At exactly 9 a.m., Steve finally walked in, still yawning, his shirt slightly wrinkled, unaware that his world was about to shift. He froze when he saw Michael at the head of the room. Richard Grant, having received a separate message, arrived moments later, looking equally confused. "What's going on?" Steve asked, feigning a laugh. "Big surprise announcement?" Michael didn't smile. "Yes," he replied evenly. "A very big one." He turned on the mounted display screen and tapped his tablet. The first video played. Steve, pocketing the marked bills from the safe. Then another, him handing an envelope to Richard. Then footage of the forged inventory logs, invoice discrepancies, and staff testimonies. Gasps echoed through the room. Steve's face drained of color. Richard looked like he'd been hit by a truck. When the last video ended, Michael stepped forward. "This is who's been running this store behind your backs. This is what your loyalty, your effort, and your integrity have been undermined by. But not anymore." 11. The atmosphere in the dining area of Maple Grove Waffles was unlike anything the staff had ever experienced. A hush had settled over the room, the kind that comes just before a storm. Employees who had once shared quiet jokes and routine complaints now stood shoulder to shoulder in stunned silence. Michael, standing tall in a tailored navy blue suit, looked every bit the executive he had once hidden away to become Matt Taylor. Gone were the humble polo shirt and faded jeans. In their place stood the man whose portrait had once hung in the main office, the founder, the visionary, the name behind the brand. Some of the employees blinked as if seeing a ghost. Emma's hand flew to her mouth. Chris stepped back instinctively. Even Mia, who had begun to suspect something, looked visibly shaken. Steve and Richard stood frozen at the rear, their smiles gone, their confidence dissolving with each second that passed. Michael raised his hand for quiet, not that it was needed. "Some of you know me as Matt," he began, his voice steady and composed. "But my real name is Michael Thompson. I'm the founder and owner of Maple Grove Waffles. I created this company to be a place of fairness, dignity, and opportunity. And over the last few weeks, I've had the chance to see what this store has become when no one thinks the owner is watching." He paused, letting the words sink in. "What I found here broke my heart." Then, with the tap of a finger on his tablet, the screen behind him lit up. Surveillance footage played, Steve stealing from the register, manipulating the safe, and counting marked bills. Another clip followed, him passing a sealed envelope to Richard. Then, audio clips of their coded conversations and manipulations. Not dramatized, not edited, just the raw truth as it had happened. Gasps rippled through the room. Emma shook her head slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief. Jordan, a weekend shift worker, whispered something inaudible to his co-worker. Michael continued, his voice hardening. "This man," he said, pointing at Steve, "has stolen over $150,000 in cash and inventory from this store alone. He has falsified supplier records, abused employees, and created a toxic environment that undermines everything this company was built to stand for." Steve opened his mouth to speak, but Michael cut him off with a single raised hand. "Don't. You've had your chance. I have weeks of documentation, video proof, forensic invoice analysis, and witness testimony. You're done." Steve sat down heavily, his confidence shattered. His face had turned a pale, sickly shade of grey. Michael turned to Richard, who looked almost offended by the confrontation. "And you," Michael added, "enabled all of it. You didn't just ignore the red flags, you protected them. You took your cut. You silenced whistleblowers. You failed at the one job you were trusted with." Richard tried to find his words, stumbling over an objection. "Mr. Thompson, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Michael said, his voice rising only slightly. "You were seen. You were recorded. And you were reported." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "This is a signed affidavit confirming that criminal charges have been filed with the district attorney's office as of this morning. Law enforcement has the footage, the financial data, and a full list of names implicated in the regional cover-up." As if on cue, two plainclothes officers entered from the side door, flashing badges as they approached the front. The energy in the room shifted again, now from shock to disbelief. "Stephen Reynolds, Richard Grant," one of the officers said, stepping forward. "You're under arrest for fraud, theft, conspiracy to commit embezzlement, and obstruction of internal corporate investigations. Please come with us." Steve didn't resist. He stood shakily, glancing around the room at the staff he'd once barked orders at, now unable to meet a single eye. Richard hesitated, puffing his chest for one last show of pride, but eventually followed suit, muttering something under his breath as the officers read him his rights. The room was silent except for the sound of handcuffs and shuffling shoes. As the two men were escorted out, Michael turned back to the remaining staff. His expression softened, but his voice remained resolute. "I owe all of you an apology," he said, "for allowing people like that to represent this brand, for being away too long, for not seeing the truth sooner. But that ends today. As of now, this store and this company are under new leadership. Real leadership. And the healing starts here." For the first time in days, the weight in the room lifted, replaced with cautious hope. The storm had passed, and in its place stood the promise of something better. 12. The next morning, the air outside was calm, but inside Michael's chest there was a soft urgency. The storm had passed at Maple Grove's flagship store, but something still lingered, unfinished, unresolved. His confrontation with Steve and Richard had sent shockwaves through the company, but in the aftermath, one name echoed in his thoughts like a steady drumbeat: Brian. The young man who had endured silently, fought for the truth, and walked away with his dignity intact, had yet to hear how his courage had changed everything. So, as the sun broke through the clouds, Michael drove to a modest apartment complex on the edge of town, holding in his hands something that represented both gratitude and a new beginning. He found Unit 17B and knocked gently, heart steady, mind focused. When the door opened, Brian stood in sweats and a worn t-shirt, eyes wide with disbelief. "Mr. Thompson?" he asked, unsure if he was seeing correctly. "Or Matt?" Michael smiled warmly. "Both," he said. "Can I come in?" Brian stepped aside, still trying to process what was happening. The apartment was simple and tidy: second-hand furniture, a stack of unopened mail, and an open laptop displaying job listings. Michael took a seat on the couch and got straight to the point. "I owe you more than an apology," he began. "You followed the rules. You stood up when no one else would. And while others tried to bury your voice, you held the line. That took strength. More than most people have." Brian didn't respond at first. His expression was still clouded with disbelief and fatigue. "I thought I was losing my mind," he admitted finally. "Everything just kept getting worse, no matter what I did." Michael nodded solemnly. "You weren't wrong, Brian. You were right. And now, I want to make it right. For you, and for the people who still believe this place can be something better." He reached into his jacket and handed Brian a formal letter on Maple Grove letterhead, signed by Michael himself. "It's an offer," he explained. "Assistant manager, starting immediately, with a path to store manager in 6 months if you want it." Brian's eyes scanned the document slowly, his hands trembling slightly. When he looked up, there was something new in his expression. Hope. Real, cautious, healing hope. "This is more than I ever expected," he said. "But I have one condition." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Name it." Brian folded the letter and placed it gently on the table. "Emma gets recognized too. She stood up for me when it cost her. She deserves more than just being a cashier." Michael smiled. "Already done. She's being promoted to floor supervisor with a raise. She doesn't know yet. I wanted to make sure you said yes first." Brian let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Then I'm in." The next stop was the store. The staff had gathered again, though this time there was no fear, just cautious curiosity. Michael stood in the middle of the dining area, flanked by Emma and Chris. He addressed the room with sincerity. "Yesterday was a reckoning," he said. "Today is the beginning of a rebuilding." He turned to Emma first. "You stayed kind in a place that made it hard. You stood up for what was right, and that's exactly the kind of leadership we need." He handed her the promotion letter, and she blinked back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Then he turned to Chris, whose posture was stiff, his eyes filled with remorse. "You made a mistake," Michael acknowledged, "but I understand why, and I believe in second chances." He handed Chris a letter of conditional employment. He would remain on staff, but under probation with mandatory ethics training and regular mentorship. Chris accepted it with a quiet nod, his shoulders dropping slightly as though a weight had been lifted. The final words Michael shared that day weren't scripted. They came from a place deeper than policy or procedure, from the heart of a man who had nearly lost his own creation to greed and now saw a chance to bring it back. This company was built on the idea that good work deserves respect, that honesty matters, and that people, no matter their role, deserve to be treated with dignity, he said. "I lost sight of that when I stepped too far away, but no more. From today forward, I will be present. I will be accountable, and I will protect the values this place was founded on." The employees stood in silence, absorbing every word. Some nodded, others wiped their eyes, and in that quiet, something powerful happened. Not the roar of celebration, but the return of trust. the belief that Maple Grove could once again be a place worth working for. That afternoon, Brian arrived at the store wearing a crisp button-down shirt and a name tag that now read Assistant Manager. Emma greeted him at the door with a hug, beaming with pride. Chris shook his hand and quietly said, "Thanks for not giving up on people like me." The restaurant was alive again, not just with customers, but with purpose. As Michael watched from the corner booth, he saw Emma training new hires, Brian speaking to vendors with quiet authority, and Chris helping a customer refill a coffee cup with an ease that hadn't been there before. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was changing. The roots of something better were being planted, watered by humility, courage, and a recommitment to everything that mattered. And as Michael stood to leave, he paused at the door, looking back one last time. This was what making things right truly looked like. 13. In the weeks that followed the dramatic turning point at the flagship Maple Grove Waffles location, a quiet but profound transformation took place. It wasn't loud or showy. There were no press releases or social media campaigns. Instead, change unfolded in the simplest of ways. The way employees began smiling at one another again, the way laughter slowly returned to the break room, and the way customers lingered just a little longer after their meals, chatting with staff as if among friends. At the center of this revival was Brian, now wearing the polished name tag of assistant manager, not with arrogance, but with quiet pride. He walked the floor each day with a calm presence, offering help, mentoring new hires, and checking in with people the way no one had checked in with him for months. The fear that had once filled the air like static had been replaced by something far more powerful: respect. Emma, now officially the floor supervisor, worked side by side with Brian as though they had been leading together for years. Her natural warmth and attention to detail complemented his steady, observant style. Together, they set the tone for the rest of the staff, building a culture of encouragement, accountability, and mutual support. Even Chris, who had once reported to Steve out of desperation, began to find new footing. With his second chance came purpose. He arrived early, stayed late, and slowly began earning back the trust he'd nearly lost. Customers noticed. One woman who had been a regular for years pulled Michael aside one afternoon and said, "I don't know what changed here, but whatever it is, it feels like home again." And that, more than anything, was how Michael knew they were on the right path. For Michael, it was like watching a garden bloom after a long winter. He began spending more time at the store, not as a distant executive, but as a founder reconnected with his roots. He walked the kitchen during prep hours, listened during staff huddles, and took time to speak with customers directly. He saw in Brian not just a dedicated employee, but a natural leader, someone who had been through the fire and emerged stronger, someone who understood what it meant to lead with empathy. Morale soared. Turnover dropped to its lowest point in over 3 years. And then came the data, the part most companies chase, but few earn the right to celebrate. Customer satisfaction scores rose by 35%. Online reviews turned overwhelmingly positive. And profits, despite the higher payroll and improved benefits, were up 21% by the end of the first quarter after the transition. But for Michael, the numbers were just confirmation of something he already felt. Maple Grove Waffles was coming back to life, not as a brand, but as a community. What had once been a fractured workplace, run by fear and favoritism, had become a model of what compassionate, honest leadership could do. Other store locations began requesting training sessions from Brian and Emma. New applicants referenced the flagship store as the one they wanted to work at. It was no longer just the first store. It had become the heart of the company again. One afternoon, while reviewing a round of internal reports, Michael looked across the table at Brian and said, "You ever think about stepping into a regional role?" Brian blinked in surprise. "You mean, like, overseeing multiple stores?" Michael nodded. "You've already started mentoring managers across 2 other locations. You're ready, and this company needs more leaders like you." Brian didn't answer right away. He glanced around the dining room, watching Emma coach a new cashier and Chris refill coffee for an elderly couple seated by the window. The store felt alive, joyful, purposeful. "I'd be honored," he finally said, his voice steady. "But only if I get to keep showing up here too. This place, it's home." Michael smiled. "That's exactly why you're the right person for it." Plans began quietly, structuring the role, planning site visits, developing a mentorship model Brian could implement at other struggling stores. And though the title hadn't officially changed yet, the influence had. Brian's leadership was already reaching far beyond the walls of 84 Westbrook Avenue. And everywhere his story traveled, about standing up, surviving, and returning with integrity, it left behind the seeds of something better. As Michael stepped outside the store later that day, the sun was just beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow over the Maple Grove Waffles sign. He paused at the curb and looked back one more time. Through the glass, he saw Brian giving instructions with confidence, Emma laughing with a customer, and Chris helping clean up a spill near the beverage station. It wasn't just a business anymore. It was a living, breathing example of what happens when people believe in something real. And as Michael walked to his car, one hand resting lightly on the door handle, he whispered to himself, This is what we were always meant to build." Maple Grove Waffles had been reborn, not through branding, but through bravery, not through policy, but through people. And it was only the beginning. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of integrity, courage, and second chances, then you're in the right place. At Deep Inside HQ, we bring you real, emotional storytelling that shines a light on the strength of everyday people in the face of injustice. Don't just watch. Be part of a community that believes in fairness, accountability, and the human spirit. Subscribe now, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and let's keep uncovering the truth, one powerful story at a time.